Good morning, everybody. This is built for big people. Yeah, well. Good morning. First of all, let me start by thanking Cynthia and Anthony and David and all of you for showing up this morning. This is a wonderful opportunity to learn more about school safety. And my good friend Anthony Petrosino, when we began to talk about this, said, you know, I want to get 9 experts together, many of them academicians, and talk about key issues related to school safety. I said, that's great. We have a day and a half to do this. He said, no, we have an hour and 20 minutes. So think about it. You know, you have 9 people, all of them who have written voluminously on many of these issues related to school safety. We're going to crunch everything down to 10 minutes. And I'm going to start by sort of laying the foundation for where we are in school safety. And actually, you know, I preceded David at the Office of Safe and Drug-Free Schools, so much of what I say is what David is going to say. It's sort of like we're coming from similar positions. I want to start by saying I want to give a history to put this sort of in perspective. And we meaning in public schools, have been dealing with misbehavior, acting out, teasing, harassment, crime since 1635. 1635 is when the first public school was opened in Boston Latin in Boston. Still open today. Excuse me, it's not open today. There was a snow day in Boston. But it's still functioning today. You know, we could go back, that's about 380 years of experience of dealing with schools. You know, 1764, the first attack on a school, Enoch Brown, and also in Pennsylvania. 10 students, 1 adult killed in that particular massacre that occurred. Then we hit in 1975. All right, so from the first 350 years or so is that when we talked about violence, if we talked about misbehavior, we talked about things going on in school that shouldn't be going on, it was strictly a state and local matter. There was no federal interference whatsoever. This is all done at the state and local matter. This began to change in 1975 when Birch Bayh and a subcommittee came out with a report called a Report Card A in School Violence and Vandalism. Essentially what Birch Bayh's committee found is that no longer are we in schools where kids were pushing and shoving each other and getting in fights where it led to a black eye. Essentially what Birch Bayh said is our schools are experiencing serious crimes of felonious nature, including brutal assaults on students, teachers, as well as rapes and extortions. So he started to paint a very different picture of what was going on in schools. I should say that there was also a Birch Bayh committee in 1974 came out with the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act, which also began to have some involvement in schools, primarily as it related to juvenile delinquency. But as we talk about a focus just on schools, it was 1975 when the first report came out. Congress did what Congress does best in 1975. They took the report and they kicked it to another agency. So what did they do? They came up in 1978, they kicked it over to HEW, the predecessor to Health and Human Services. And Joe Califano and his crew came up with a report called Safe Schools, the Safe Schools Study Report to Congress. And essentially what he said is that everything Congress found out 3 years earlier is true, is that there's a significant amount of crime and disruption in school. He also said is that the problem is probably being underreported, but the reason why we don't know whether it's underreported or not is because there's no accurate collection of data in 1978 as it pertained to school crime. So schools were doing it differently, states were doing it differently, districts were doing it differently, but there's no accurate portrayal of what was going on in regards to schools. You know, but what he says is that there's sort of a tendency, and we all have this tendency to paint a good picture or bright picture. So as they went out and did interviews, he felt that there was the tendency to underestimate the problem, and the problem was actually much greater than they then perceived. 1987 was the first attempt on the part of government as far as directing funds directly to schools. As I said, prior to that, there were funds going to schools out of the Department of Justice, but this was the first attempt in 1987 called the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act. Okay, so from 1987 up to 1994, schools were receiving funds for drug prevention, alcohol prevention, and tobacco prevention, but not violence prevention, not anything to do directly with safe schools. That first event came in 1994. It's a small act. It's a piece of legislation that was funded for 1 year. It was sort of a bridge legislation, bridge between doing nothing in violence, the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act, to 1994, when that act was amended in part of the Improving America's Schools Act. So in 1994, we have the American Schools Act. Essentially what that said is now we not only have the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act, we have the Safe and Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act, and said, hey, listen, all that money we're giving you could now be used for violence prevention. And this really led to a significant shift. If you go back and begin to take a look, is that money began to move away from programs that were specifically related to drug prevention over to programs, activities, and policies that were related to violence prevention. Also in this provision is something that was buried away in the Improving America Schools Act. It's called the GunFree Schools Act. Now, many would say that this was the first zero-tolerance policy that was implemented and pushed down on states, essentially what the GunFree Schools Act states. And this act is still viable today. It's still part of the law today. What it says is that every state must pass a law requiring that those individuals, students, who bring a firearm to school shall be expelled for 1 year. Now, there were some provisions that basically allowed that to be minimized, but nevertheless, this was a 1-year provision for bringing a firearm to school, expulsion. Now, so we had two pieces of legislation. We had loads of money, millions of dollars going into safe schools, and things began to change. As David said, there was good news. We began a robust data collection effort. Now, if you go today, you'll see there's a significant Department of Justice, Department of Education, CDC, Centers for Disease Control, Health and Human Services, all basically provide information related to safe schools. Increased emphasis on research and evaluation, support of science-based programs. Again, since 1995, the Department of Education and other agencies have been promoting science-based programs. Let's fund science-based programs. Growing number of partners. If you were in education 20 years ago, you said, who did you partner with? Some may say, well, the fire department, the police department, maybe mental health, but probably not. And today, if you look at a school, is what you see is schools have partners throughout the community, with religious institutions, with communities, with businesses, as well as with law enforcement, fire, emergency management. Movement towards a comprehensive approach to school safety, such as the Safe Schools, Healthy Students model. You're basically saying is we can't. There's no one program that could really fix everything. Is we really need a comprehensive program. Adoption of emergency management plans. You know, today, over 95% of schools have emergency management plans. Identification of students who are on a pathway to violence through some of the work done by the Secret Service Department of Education is we have a better idea of those students who pose a risk to themselves or to others. And recognition, I think this is one of the more important ones, is essentially is that we have a recognition that mental health services are an essential part of school safety. If you asked the school 10, 15 years ago if that was the case, most people would say, well, maybe, maybe not. But we've come to the point and position where we clearly know that mental health services have to be part of our overall efforts. And all these programs tied together have led to a lot of successes. You know, homicides in schools are less than 2% of the total number of youth between the ages of 12 and 18 who are homicide victims. Essentially what that means, and that's not, you know, what it's saying is that schools are not a place where homicides usually take place. Violent crime decreased by more than 50% from 1992 to 2012. Serious violent crime decreased by more than 50%. Students, the percentage of students reported gangs in their schools decreased. The number of students reported being bullied decreased. So there's some signs out there that show is that the work that you've been doing has been paying off, and that crime and violence in schools is at a lower point, probably at one of its lowest points that it's been in the past 10 or 20 years. But there's storm clouds out there. Weapon carrying remains an issue. Percentage of students reported being threatened or injured with a weapon increased from 7.3 to 7.4%. Now, that's not a significant increase, but the line is going in the wrong direction. The number of teachers who were physically attacked were increased, and a number of violations of the GunFree Schools Act the levels remain high. So, what do we need to do? I have 6 points here, which I think is the direction. We could probably spend the entire day talking about what programs, what policies, and the direction we need to move. But here are 6, I think, that I would put on the table for consideration. One is to continue to engage in what I call relevant research. That's research that's needed by educators, not necessarily by researchers, but by educators. We need to reach out to our constituency, to the base, and say, what is it that you need, and engage in that what I call relevant research. The second part of that is to ensure that that research is used. We need to ensure that school culture is such that every student is connected and every student is respected. We need to find alternatives to policies and practices needlessly push many students out of schools. We still have rates of suspension that are too high. Practical approach to deal comprehensively with all those issues that David was mentioning, trafficking, sexting, whatever the case may be. They're being dumped on schools, and they can't develop a program for every issue that's out there. Lastly, we need to find a solution to getting firearms out of schools and out of the hands of students. Thank you. I'm now going to invite Simone Roberts to come up. Roberts.